interesting and important persons. I will not go into what the book is, but all I can say about the book is that Mr. Ramesh has really gone into great detail. I think must have trod every piece of evidence on the subject available anywhere. He's of course a very prolific user of this library, despite being a full-time politician. He does find time, and over the years, I can say with a fair amount of familiarity, since Jairam and I first met each other 44 or so years ago, when he was the bright young student of IIT Bombay, and his friend those days, maybe still now, another young man called Nanda Nilekani, and both of them we met long time back in December of 1974. I'm seeing his growth, seeing his various forms, seeing his intervention in public policy over the years, not just in politics, but public policy very generally, and his abilities and growing abilities as a writer. So when we thought of this book, we said, yes, this is a book which needs to be discussed. The kind of role Mr. Haksar played and the kind of relationship they had with each other, and the falling out. And despite the falling out, the later kind of meeting each other, but yet having that kind of standoffishness between the two. And these were momentous times for India. The leftward swing of the Indian politics, the nationalization of the banks, the split in the Congress party, Mrs. Gandhi's letter to Morarji Desai, drafted by Mr. Haksar, that yes, you and I disagree and you expressed yourself very strongly, and I'm very grateful to you for doing so. And therefore, I think it's not fair that I should burden you with the finance ministry portfolio, which I will take over myself. And yet, when Morarji becomes Prime Minister, and Mr. Haksar is the Deputy Chairman Planning Commission and a host of other things, and he resigns, and Morarji says, no, please stay on. And when he resigns, presses his resignation and goes. It's a very, very affectionate kind of So really saying that in many ways, being frank and honest is not a bad quality at all. We are webcasting this live. So, and to discuss this book, we're trying to wonder who could be a good person. Dr. Vivek, Katju, another old friend, who has the double distinction on one hand, of course, being a very eminent member of the Foreign Service, and in various forms having seen many of these things. Though he belongs to, in that sense, a later period. But there are a lot of continuity in government and in government records. How we discovered this Jawaharlal Nehru's notebook on the Commonwealth Conference of 1960 or so, Vivek was telling me, in the for MEA archives, which were then handed over here to Mr. Ravindra Kumar, the then director. And of course, Vivek also being, not sounding parochial, a good Kashmiri boy from Allahabad, where Mr. Haksar is from. And the families are in many ways intertwined in many, many ways. So Vivek, what we thought, and grateful to him because he has just come back this morning from his travels. But he says, don't worry, though I'm reaching Delhi in the morning, I will be here for the discussion. So my team was a little nervous. I'm grateful that their nervousness has evaporated on seeing Vivek here. So let me, as I said, I will not go into the book. I've just spoken 2 sentences about the book. I will not speak more. It's best that I join you in listening. So let me hand it over to Vivek. Will you start the ball rolling? So why don't you two of you have a conversation for about half an hour, for 45 minutes or so. And then we have a lot of interested people and more will be joining us to continue.
We'll go up to 12. Shakti, thank you very much for inviting me for this book. And I can tell you I won't have missed this conversation for the world because both at a professional level and a personal level I find this book fascinating. Jairam, you've done an amazing job in describing the life of a man who contributed so much to shaping of events in a very critical phase of our history. And also in pointing out his qualities, the qualities of leadership that he had. I, for one, have found Haksar's journey from the time that he was a student at the Allahabad University to his days in London, which shaped him, and so many people of his generation who played a part in the making of modern India, to the time that he returns and was for about a year a communist in Nagpur, a worker, to his legal days in, brief as they were, in Allahabad, and growing up in Allahabad, occasionally I used to hear some anecdotes about those days from my father, my uncles, about, as they called him, Babbu Bhai. To his time in the Foreign Service, and his entry into government itself I found very revealing, because to my mind it was indicative of the tensions that existed, unless I am totally wrong, between Jawaharlal ji and Sardar Patel. Because it struck me very forcefully that why should Haksar be called to the Ministry of External Affairs to work on a report on the recent history of communal disturbances in India. And the fact that the Home Ministry under Sardar Patel resisted this was not unnatural. To then his induction in the Foreign Service and his service there, and finally to his coming to Delhi, to the Prime Minister's office, building up that office, and moving on to the Planning Commission, and after his retirement becoming a public intellectual who also continued with his association with the state in some ways. Now, his story coincides with the enormous changes that took place in India during these decades. The decades since the 30s to the 90s. You've explored all this in a fascinating way. And there's so many themes that emerge from your exploration that they can be themes that can be taken up in a full-fledged seminar. And I would suggest, once Shakti returns, I'll suggest to him that this can be the basis of a seminar here, because the life of Haksar in many ways lends itself to all those matters. So I've had enormous difficulty in picking up themes. But in order to go into specific areas, I thought I'll ask you to distill, say, 5 words which you would associate with Haksar, his life, his times, his work. I've written down 5 words, and I really wanted to know whether those 5 words would be, say, similar to the 5 words would come to your mind.
You want to answer now?
Yes, 5 words, so that then we can proceed on.
Well, that's
googly.
You put me on the spot, and this is a real googly, unlike the other googly. Kartarpur googly. This is a Katju googly. I think the first word that comes to my mind is Marxist. His whole approach to life was a Marxian mode of inquiry. It remained with him till his last day. And I think he was not a Marxist in the ideological sense, but he was a Marxist in the intellectual sense. I mean, he saw everything in terms of class, in terms of class struggle, class relations. So the first thing that comes to my mind is Marxist. Second thing that comes to my mind is commanding heights, public sector. He was, in 1970, when he was fighting Sanjay Gandhi on the Maruti project, he was telling Indira Gandhi that
Maruti is not needed. India does not need passenger cars. India needs a public transport system. However, if you want to go for private transport, manufacture millions of scooters, and if you want to manufacture millions of scooters, do so in the public sector. And that was how Scooters India was born. So he was an uncompromising believer in the public sector. And this, it just pervaded his entire economic philosophy, not only during the years that he was in power, but also in the years that he was out of power. So first Marxist, second public sector. Third, uncompromisingly secular in the true sense of the term, which is separation of state and religion. He was a Nehruvian in that sense of the term. However, he was not blind. He thought that many of the things that Nehru did not do detracted from Indian secularism. He was critical of Nehru for not having gone in for a uniform civil code in the 50s. He was critical of the Nehru-Liaquat Pact of April 1950, because what he said was that the pact gave Indians the authority to look after the welfare of Hindus in Pakistan and gave Pakistan the authority to look after the welfare of Muslims in India. He says this is hogwash. The welfare of Muslims in India is the responsibility of India, and the responsibility of Hindus in Pakistan is the responsibility of Pakistan. So he was I would say the third word is he was uncompromisingly secular, but in the true sense of the word secular, which is religion has nothing to do with state. We are a multi-religious society, but the state has to be completely indifferent to all religions, or be equidistant from all religions. So that's the third word that I would say. The fourth word is blind loyalty to Indira Gandhi. He was loyal to her much beyond what would have been expected. He was loyal to her as his uncle was being put behind bars. He was loyal to her as his house was being raided. He was loyal to her as his wife was about to be arrested. He was loyal to her, even as she chose her son over him in 1973. He saw her not only as Nehru's daughter, which is an important part of the equation, but he saw her as somebody who was committed to secular values of the Constitution and who could bring about the socialist transformation that his generation had envisaged in the 30s. He thought of her as a democratic socialist, which he felt he was, which he believed he was. So the first was blind loyalty, I would say. Total loyalty, I wouldn't say blind. Total loyalty, because he was not blind to her faults, but it was ultimately total loyalty to Indira Gandhi. And fifth, I would say, he was a complete believer, even though he was a Marxist. He was completely Indian in that sense of the term. It's extraordinary that his last conversations were with Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi. And one of the organizations that kept pestering him to come and speak and attend seminars was the Deen Dayal Research Institute, of which then Mr. K.R. Malkani was running the institute. He was steeped in Persian, he was steeped in Urdu, but very few people know that he was a Sanskrit scholar. He studied Sanskrit till the age of 16. In fact, he was more conversant with Sanskrit than any other language in the first few years of his life. So he was Indian in that sense of the term. It was, and there's a wonderful letter in his archives. By the way, I must say that this book would not have been possible without the Nehru Memorial. This extraordinary place where you can spend a lot of hours educating yourself and writing books. So, one of the last letters that he writes, he's dying, he writes to Catherine Frank, who is the biographer of Indira Gandhi, and he writes to her in Sanskrit and he provides the translation. This is a man who is blind, he's suffering from cancer, he's in hospital, and he tells Catherine Frank, there is an ancient Indian saying, Vaidyaraj namastubhyam, yamastu sahodara, yamastu harati pranan, tvam tu pranan dhananicha. And he quotes this from memory, that Vaidyaraj, you are Yamraj's younger brother. Yamraj only takes away life, but Vaidyaraj, doctor, you take away life and wealth also. and he writes to Catherine Frank that not only is my life going to go, but my wealth is also going to go. So he was really Indian in that sense of the term. So I hope I've answered your question.
I was trying to see whether my choice of words and yours were the same. And the 5 I've written here were vanity, loyalty, intellectual, statecraft, and secular. So I'm happy that at least 3 things are the same, and the first 2 that you mentioned would come within the rubric of intellectual. But I'd go from secular, I'd proceed back. You've of course mentioned this in your book that his secularism was classic Western secularism, the separation of church and state. And then you so well put it that he was, there was this belief which I think Mr. Ansari, our former vice president, has been saying of the state being equidistant from all religions and hence his opposition to the Hindu Code Bill. But I've often wondered whether people of his generation and who intellectually grew up in the London or in England of the 1930s really missed the point of how to deal with a country where faith is so important. You'd agree that he was not a man of faith. And in fact, you mentioned in your book how unsparing he was on Indian religiosity, which he and people like him equated with superstition. So, was this a general failing of the class, along with this emphasis on class, missing out caste altogether and its role in Indian society, which led to a lot of misanalysis and therefore actions that could not fructify fully when it came to, say, the entire approach of the left in managing our affairs?
I think his position was a classic Western liberal tradition, no doubt about it. It was also classic Marxian tradition, that class will ultimately override all forms of distinctions in society. Although Mr. Haksar's thesis at the London School of Economics was on the role of caste. It's extraordinary. He wrote in a thesis under the great Malinowski, the great anthropologist, he took villages in Madhya Pradesh and showed how caste equations were changing, how people changed caste identities, and how economic growth, such as it was at that time, was leading to caste barriers, changing. So, it's not as if he rejected caste identity. It's not as if he was blind to the place of religion and faith in our society. But I think in the classic Marxist Western liberal tradition, he believed that faith is a matter of personal choice. The state must have nothing to do with choice of faith. And the state must not be equiproximate, but must be equidistant. It's one thing being equiproximate, but it's another thing being equidistant. And I think he rejected equiproximity And in that sense, I would say, Mahatma Gandhi represented the equiproximity school of secularism, and Nehru represented the equidistance school of secularism. And this is a broad categorization, and I think Haksar fell into the Nehruvian school much more clearly and much more strongly than the Gandhian thought. Was this a mistake? I believe that if you look at Nehru's interviews, Vivek, to Tibor Minde, if you've read the great interviews, the great interviews that he gave to Tibor Minde, Conversation Mende, and the originals are here at Timurti. And Mende asks Nehru in '59, what has been your greatest challenge and frustration, Mr. Prime Minister? And Nehru responds, to build a just society to build a just state in a religious society. He says, to build a secular, he goes on to say, to build a secular state in a multi-religious society. So it's not as if Nehru or Haksar were blind to religion and faith. It's just that they had an overriding belief that economic growth, that economic advancement, that urbanization, which would blur religious identities and would give economic factors much more importance in identity creation. As it turns out, that assumption has been wrong. As it turns out, the more educated you are, the more urban you are, the more aspirational you are, the more you seem to be rediscovering your religious roots and religious identity. So to that extent, I think they were a little over-optimistic in their expectation that class would trump all other factors.
You're right, and this phenomena that you were mentioning of people as they get more prosperous, discovering a new discovering their religious roots more and expressing them is not peculiar to India. It's now all over the world, and the Soviets tried this for such a long time in Central Asia, and we see the resurgence of Islam in different forms now. So it's not here alone. But let me just explore that a moment more. And I was fascinated when he said that why shouldn't there be a common civil code? I wonder whether you came across anything where he had explored this further. Because it's okay to say that there should be a common civil code. The difficulty lies in what it will be based on. He himself, I think his marriage too was perhaps a civil marriage. If you see the photograph, it seems it was civil marriage. So he shunned all kinds of religion as faith. Though I'm a little confused to where he put spirituality. Because there are a couple of references in your book where there's intellect, there's spirituality, there's religion or faith. And on spirituality, I'm still a little confused of what he thought. But did you find anything of what would be the nature of the common civil code?
Well, he was totally irreligious, but I would say in his own way he was spiritual, in the sense that he was exploring the sources of tradition, whether it was Islamic tradition, or whether it was Hindu tradition, or whether it was the Christian tradition. He was a rebel in his personal life. He married his second cousin, and amongst you Kashmiri Pandits, you can't, this is a taboo. And in fact, he had to marry in Bombay. He couldn't even marry, he had to marry in his sister's house, and there were only 8 people present there. So it was quite a furor in the early 50s. And his wife, by the way, was even more of a Marxist than him. She was a distinguished intellectual in her own right, and was a very important member of the first committee that was set up on the status of women in India, which submitted its report in 1974. And she was one of the 4 or 5 people who were contributed very heavily to the writing of that report. And that was a landmark report for gender justice. which led, for example, to minimum wage equality, equal pay for equal work, and a number of other things. I did not find in the thousands of papers here at Tinmurti any great exploration of how a uniform civil code would look like, but I would say that he would have been very comfortable with what the Portuguese did in Goa. People don't realize in our country that there is one state in India that has a common civil code already. Goa is not covered; it's covered still by the code of the Portuguese.
And what is it? I'm sure
It's secular in the sense that you don't. I mean, for example, it's a marriage. There are four things that a common civil code, personal law has to deal with: marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption. These are the four things. And in these four things in Goa, it's not religious law that prevails; it's common law that prevails, which is the law that the Portuguese. This is the Napoleonic code. So I think what Haksar was arguing for was a code in which would be derived from best practice. And to give you a simple example, in the matter of divorce, that the woman should have equal rights as men, and whatever is provided in secular law that is passed by the Constitution should be applicable to women across religions. I think that's the position that he would have articulated, although I didn't find any written evidence that he would have done it. But I think the Goa model is something that he would have certainly advocated.
Let me move to statecraft. Haksar's imprint on the evolution of our foreign policy during the period that he was Mrs. Gandhi's secretary and principal secretary, and on internal developments was very substantial. In fact, it came to me as I was reading your book that between Mrs. Gandhi and Haksar, because that was in a sense during that period it was a partnership, an intellectual partnership, that between them they shaped or reshaped the geography of the subcontinent. Sikkim came into the Union, that was one. Before that, it was in 1961 that Goa had come into the Union. And then, of course, East Pakistan became Bangladesh. And if I'm correct in my memory, after that there's been no changes. In fact, if I recollect correctly, Jaswant Singh Ji had said in one context that map making must cease. So that was the time when it came. Also on our internal policy, as you so well put it, that is the period when the Marxist ideologies were being implemented, not in a classical sense, but with variations, but the inspiration came from there. What endures today? The India has changed so much, and that is also something that in the 90s, did he focus on the changes? You mentioned that he says at one stage that if Manmohan is saying this, then it must be all right. But what has endured? Do you think anything endures today?
A couple of things have endured, Vivek. We're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of bank nationalization next year. So bank nationalization has endured. And certainly Mr. Vajpayee didn't talk of bank denationalization. There have been two non-Congress chief, Mr. Moraji Desai didn't talk of bank denationalization. Mr. V.P. Singh, Mr. Chandrasekhar, Mr. Deve Gowda, Mr. Gujral, Mr. Vajpayee, and certainly Mr. Modi has not talked about denationalization of banks. So I would say the most visible symbol of that period is bank nationalization, which got nationalized in July of 1969. I think what endures today are large public sector companies, ONGC, BHEL, unfortunately, one company that was set up during his time and because of his patronage got privatized some years ago. But some of these large, the oil companies, the energy sector companies, certainly have endured. Okay, and there's really no move to get away from that mod. I think if anything, people expected Mr. Modi to privatize, but even Mr. Modi is now, bought into the idea that the public sector has to be an engine of growth. So that has endured. What has endured, Vivek, to take another third example from your own field in which you are more knowledgeable than me, the line of control in J&K has endured. And I have said so in my book. There's a lot of criticism of Mr. Haksar that he helped Indira Gandhi win the war in 1971, but Indira Gandhi lost the peace in 1972 in Simla. But if I just take you back in time, what happened in Simla was that the ceasefire line became the line of control. What the line of control didn't become in Simla, which people now wanted, that it should become the international border. It didn't happen, and we can discuss this, why it didn't happen. But that line of control has endured, Vivek. And during the height of the Kargil, war, the one decision of the then Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, which earned India international support, was his directive that India will not cross the line of control. So the line of control became a de facto border as far as we were concerned and as far as Pakistan was concerned, although they violated it. So we respected the LOC. That's the point I want to make. So that has endured. That has certainly endured. What has also endured is the overarching influence of the Prime Minister's establishment. Now, this has pluses.
I'll explore that further with you.
This has pluses and this has minuses. Although during Mr. Haksar's time, it was called Prime Minister's Secretariat. It becomes Prime Minister's office only when Mr. Morarji Desai is Prime Minister.
To downgrade it. That was the logic.
Well, they downgraded it in name, but increased the numbers. During Mr. Haksar's time, you could count the number of joint secretaries and number of officials in the Prime Minister's Secretariat, but now they are in hundreds. So, but however, the point that has endured, the overarching influence of the Prime Minister's establishment, and not just as a coordination mechanism, but also as a beacon for the rest of the government, that has in fact not only endured, that has gone from strength to strength. So these are four things that have endured. And he was one thing of his time that has not endured. Certainly, our relationship with the U.S. Has in fact been transformed, and he was deeply, deeply suspicious of the U.S. establishment. He was deeply suspicious of the U.S. role in South Asia, and that certainly has not endured. Let me also say, Vivek, since you asked me, the one thing that has endured is his 1987 trip to Beijing. That has in fact endured.
Seminal.
That is, in my view, that's rather understated and seminal contribution that he made. He and Mr. V.V. Paranjpe went and spent a week, and that paved the way for Mr. Gandhi's visit to Beijing in December 1988, and then subsequently visits by Mr. Narasimha Rao and Mr. Vajpayee and so on. But that May 1987 visit, which was really the rapprochement and the normalization with China, has certainly endured.
Permit me to add to this. I think, and this was the Nehruvian heritage, this emphasis that India will become a first-rate scientific and technological power. You mentioned this, you've quoted Haksar, and that to my mind was the core of Nehruvian belief, that we'd lost out in the first industrial revolution. We will not lose out any more when it came to science and technology, that the reason for our backwardness was backwardness in these areas. And therefore the emphasis on setting up first-rate institutions of which you are a product, not only technological, but for pure science, scientific work. And his contributions in continuing the work that Nehru did, I think, was phenomenal.
Absolutely. I should have mentioned
ISRO,
that,
AEC, all the defense industries.
I should have mentioned this actually. I'm glad you brought this up, because I think one of the great contributions that Haksar made, and Indira Gandhi was not insensitive to it, but the fact that he really provided the leadership. And I think the most inspired decision that Mr. Haksar took in the 5.5 years that he was with Indira Gandhi when it came to personnel was to persuade Satish Dhawan to become the chairman of the Indian Space Research Organization when Dr. Sarabhai had died suddenly. Mr. Dhawan was unwilling, and he put some impossible conditions. And it was only Haksar who could persuade Indira Gandhi and the bureaucracy to agree to these conditions. And what were these conditions? Satish Dhawan said, I must continue as director in Indian Institute of Science. Agreed. And secondly, he said, I should operate out of Bangalore. And incidentally, that one decision of Satish Dhawan led to the emergence of Bangalore as a very major technological center, which had, of course, its other implications on the IT industry in the 80s and 90s. So the choice of Dhawan in 1972, his decision in the late 60s that India must go nuclear, and his selection of Setna as successor to Sarabhai, because he believed that Setna would provide the engineering. The building the bomb is more an engineering task than a scientific task. The science is known, but it's the engineering that's very important. And Setna was the father of our plutonium reprocessing. So that was very, 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 very crucial. And very interestingly, something that I got to know only through the archives, which I hadn't known, in the Green Revolution, the selection of Swaminathan, the selection of Dr. Swaminathan, who is still alive. And there's a wonderful story that associated with this, which I have quoted in the book, that the great Dr. B.P. Pal retires as the Director General of ICAR, and Swaminathan is selected. And Swaminathan goes to Mr. Haksar and says, I'm going to take over. And Haksar says, Swami, don't take over till I tell you. And for 2 months, Swaminathan does not hear from Mr. Haksar. And finally, in April of 1972, Swaminathan is told by Haksar, now you can join. And Swaminathan says, for a few days I was mystified why this delay took place. Then I realized when I saw the office order, my office order said, Dr. Swaminathan is hereby appointed Director General, Indian Council of Agricultural Research, and ex officio secretary to the Department of Agricultural Research and Education, which was a newly created department, whereas his original office order said that he would be DG ICAR and ex officio additional secretary to the Government of India. And Haksar said that why should you, as an agricultural scientist, report to some IAS? He had contempt for the IAS and the ICS. And one of the reasons is he sat for the ICS and he did it very poorly. He did very poorly. He couldn't get through the ICS. Maybe that sort of was there in his mind. But he had contempt for the ICS and the IAS. And he told Swaminathan, look, you're a scientist. You should be running Indian science. So I think his ability to pick people. B.D. Chaudhary, very important. Abdul Kalam is given the credit for India's nuclear capability, but before Kalam, there was B.D. Chaudhary, Vice Chancellor of JNU, Member Planning Commission, student of M.N. Saha, great nuclear physicist who was Kalam's predecessor many times removed, a scientific advisor, who Haksar brought into the Ministry of Defense. And that's when India's nuclear missile program, submarine program starts with Nag Chaudhary at the helm in the Ministry of Defense. So I think his contributions to picking people, I think the task of a leader, Vivek, is to pick people.
That's true.
Is to pick right people, give them the freedom to operate, give them autonomy, give them independence, and most importantly, protect them. What did Dhawan do when our first rocket launch failed? And Kalam was down in depression. So Dhawan said, I take the responsibility for the failure. And 8 months later, when the rocket launch vehicle succeeded, he wanted Kalam to be in front and take the credit for the success. That's leadership, So I think whether it was Swaminathan, whether it was Setna, whether it was Dhawan, the ability to pick people and give them the freedom and protect them was a great characteristic of Mr. Haksar, and Mrs. Gandhi relied on that. I think when Mrs. Gandhi began to depend on R.K. Dhawan rather than Satish Dhawan, then the things began to sort of slide. That's a good one.
That's a good one. But what struck me in your book, and I'm happy you mentioned agriculture, and this is something that we forget generally. You mentioned that amongst the first things that Haksar did when he came in was to draft a letter for General Nevin.
Yes.
In Burma, to permit some shipments of rice, if I'm not mistaken. Now, can you imagine that was our condition then? So it were people like him who realized that unless we could feed ourselves, there was ship to mouth. There was no question of freedom of anything. I mean, there was no question of having a free, independent policies if you go and feed yourselves. And that is something that we don't realize. I know that we can have difference of opinion whether there should have been a greater focus on agriculture, etc. But I'll just make one observation and then move on. I think the complexities of changing our agricultural scene are sometimes not realized. It was really changing a feudal system into a modern system. But let me move to some other things. And they may be a little harsh, but I think Haksar was objective, if anything. You mentioned his loyalty, and at one stage you've said that to you it seems that he was more loyal to systems, more loyal to ideologies, etc. But, and you've also mentioned that there was total, and though you modified your word blinding to total, blind loyalty, total loyalty to Mrs. Gandhi. What pained me a great deal was his admission, and that is what you've quoted, I think, Mr. Tandon, if I'm not mistaken, Vishan Tandon, where he tells Maya Ray that they made me go from judge to judge. Tell me, I've often wondered, as I was reading your book, the thought came to me that was that one of the reasons above everything else that broke Urmila Haksar? To see T.N. Haksar, to see her husband, Parmeshwar Haksar, who had by his training as a lawyer, would have realized that that is something you just don't do, to lobby a judge. And he says, they made me go from judge to judge. So here we talk of, it is not committed judiciary. It is something altogether different. But did you find anything more on this, except that little reference?
No. Actually, you see, this whole episode of the emergency, it's quite interesting. Mrs. Gandhi Raj Narayan took her to court in 1971 on 6 violations of the Representation of People's Act, on 6 corrupt practices. And interestingly, Vivek, people don't realize that Justice Jagmohan Sinha, Allahabad High Court judgment of June 12th, 1975, acquits Indira Gandhi of 4 of the 6 charges and finds her guilty on 2 charges. Now, what are those 2 charges? It's, today when we read about it, these 2 charges appear bizarre. The first charge is that in Raebareli, Shubho, you may remember this, the first charge was that in Raebareli, the dais and the microphone was provided by the state government. This was the first charge. And Justice Sinha said, yes, this is a violation, it's a corrupt practice. State government, on security grounds, routinely every Prime Minister, the state government provides the rostrum and provides that Chicago. At that time it used to be Chicago. Now it is Motwane or whatever it is. Import substitution has taken place, so it used to be Chicago. So this is a corrupt practice. Second corrupt practice was Yashpal Kapoor, who was OSD in the Prime Minister's Secretariat, had resigned on January 27th, 1971, but he had drawn salary for 2 weeks. He had campaigned for Mrs. Gandhi starting January 14th, 1971. So for a period of 13 days, he was drawing a government salary, which was a corrupt practice. And these were the 2 charges on which Mrs. Gandhi was indicted. And this led to the emergency. I asked Prashant Bhushan, by the way. Prashant was there as a young lawyer taking notes because his father was Raj Narayan's lawyer. And he showed me all his notes of the Allahabad High Court. And I asked Prashant, isn't this a technicality? He said, well, if you ask me, really, these are 2 technicalities, but the law is the law. The majesty of the law is to be upheld, and she was held guilty. Now, Mr. Haksar, see, this is truly, truly extraordinary that a man like Mr. Haksar, Mr. Yashpal Kapoor gives the resignation letter on the 14th of January 1971. Now, if somebody gives you a resignation letter and you want to accept it, you will sign Vivek Katju and of that day. Mr. Haksar kept it on the side and said, "Theek hai, jao, you have resigned." The signature of Mr. Haksar on file accepting Mr. Yashpal Kapoor's resignation is dated 27th of January 1971. Mr. Haksar goes to Allahabad in February 1975, where you met him for the first time and only time, to give evidence before Justice Sinha. And Justice Sinha asks him, is this normal practice to take decisions orally? So Mr. Haksar says, yes, I was appointed orally. My office order appointing me as Secretary to Prime Minister came after I had taken over. So Mr. Sinha is befuddled. He says, how can... And then Prashant's father says, this is impossible. Government cannot function on oral orders. So what had happened was that orally he had accepted the resignation, but on file, when the file was produced, it was produced as 27th of January, and so for 13 days, Mr. Yashpal Kapoor was shown to be drawing a government salary, although he didn't draw. That was the irony of the situation. Did Mr. Haksar commit perjury? This is the question that I have raised in the book. The evidence seems to show that willy-nilly he was protecting Mrs. Gandhi. He wanted to protect Mrs. Gandhi and said to the judge that I had accepted the resignation on the 14th. Although in actual point of fact, it was dated 27th. So, you could say that was a false
photograph.
That was something that. Second is this episode where he was asked to go from judge to judge, and one of the judges was a very close friend of his, Justice Hamidullah Beg, who were together at Lincoln's Inn in London going back to the 1930s, late 1930s. But that is no excuse. He went to at least 2 or 3 judges. I think I put that down to the fact that in spite of the Pandit brothers, in spite of whatever had happened, he was completely loyal to Indira Gandhi till the very end. Whatever had happened, he was loyal to her.
No, you bring back many memories. I was in Jagmohan Lal Sinha's court when he delivered the judgment. So I remember that my cousin Markande and I were both there. And then I very vividly recollect the intense discussions that took place at home. My father was then a judge of the High Court, and when my father became a judge of the High Court, he and Jagmohan Lal Sinha sat on the same bench for 9 months, with some criminal bench dealing with capital cases. So you brought back many memories of that day, of those days, and you were right. There were technicalities. But the point I was making was a little different. Sinha's judgment, to my mind, was not a particularly good judgment, but he was faced with a peculiar situation because the law demands that if there was any infraction, then it would be technically corrupt practice and inevitably lead to a 6-year disqualification. So that was the difficulty there, but the events that took place after that here, you all know, I don't need to go into it. But on loyalty, it's a very technical question that again I'm raising, but perhaps because Shakti and I have been both civil servants, it struck me that, and perhaps Shakti can be more, he'll be able to give you more insight into this. Struck me that as secretary to the Prime Minister, he was still a serving Foreign Service officer. And as a serving Foreign Service officer, in a civil service tradition which relies on neutrality, because I honestly believe that unless our civil service is neutral, the country suffers. He dabbled not only in administrative work, which of course he should have, but he dabbled in Congress politics. Where does that go to? I mean, it's a serious thing for us to consider that as a civil servant, once you resign, today there are principal secretaries who have resigned, who have retired, and that's one thing. But did this ever strike you?
Yeah. He was a civil servant only till the 4th of September 1971. He retires from the service on the 4th of September. He becomes principal secretary to Mrs. Gandhi in December of 71. So whatever he does post December 71 is fine. Now, we are talking of pre-71. Drafting letters for Indira Gandhi to Nijalingappa. Telling Indira Gandhi, sack Moraji Desai, don't sack Y.B. Chauhan. Yes, he crossed the Lakshman Rekha. But Mrs. Gandhi did not bring him in to her office to be a normal secretary.
He could have resigned,
No, yeah, he could have resigned. But I think the relationship, remember Mrs. Gandhi had L.K. Jha as her secretary. And she believed that L.K. Jha and others led her up the garden path on the devaluation episode. And she wanted somebody by her side who would not only have the national interest in perspective, but also would be good enough, bold enough, honest enough to look after her interests. Because frankly, she found herself under siege. Remember, Vivek, this was a period, we think of Indira Gandhi as a courageous, as an iron-willed, as a tough, authoritative lady. Fact is, from 1967 till 1971, she was tentative. She was uncertain. She was under siege within her own party. Her own party bosses were conspiring against her. And this whole episode of bringing Sanjeeva Reddy as a presidential candidate was to carry out a coup of sorts against her by the syndicate. So she wanted somebody, and that is why she gets Haksar out of diplomatic obscurity in London. And I think she knew that with him there, not only would he give a certain ideological orientation which was needed after the devaluation debacle, but she would have somebody who would look after her interests. Did he cross the Lakshman Rekha? Yes. Did he do more than what a normal civil servant should have? Yes. But the only justification I can find for this is that she relied on him. Every time C. Subramaniam or Ashok Mehta would give her something, she would send it to Haksar, and Haksar would then work on it, and then it would go out as under Indira Gandhi's name. Are these things that civil servants should be doing? Did Mr. Haksar influence Congress politics? Yes. The 1969 split of the Congress took place largely because of the machinations of Mr. Haksar. No doubt about it. But he could do it because Indira Gandhi wanted him to do it.
And we'll just take a few minutes more, but...
I have a couple of questions lined up myself.
Okay, good. Then I'll just finish quickly, Shakti. I used one word there, urbane. I think that represented his cultural world, urbanity, which doesn't, with a lot of vigor, intellectual vigor, and you've done that very well, where you've shown that he took interest in the cultural institutions that we have, and he had this report. I really wonder what happened to the report. That's a remarkable aspect, and he represented a cultural tradition and a tradition of discourse, which I find, unfortunately, is now languishing. It needs to be revived. Discourse, a vibrant discourse within the political class, of which you are an eminent member, a vibrant discourse among our social scientists. I regret to say what is taking place today instead of discourse on ideas is name calling. That's what's happening. But let me leave it at that because Shakti is... let me turn to my final thing, which of course you mentioned, the line of control. At Simla, and ultimately he negotiated Simla because D.P. Dhar was out, he was ill, and I think T.N. Cole was there, but the principal reins were in his hand. You've written in your book that one of the objectives that he mentions before negotiations began, and let me compliment you, you've done it so well on the Simla Agreement, the events that preceded it, his own role in seeing that the organizational effort for the 1971 war went ahead smoothly. But at that stage, after the war was won and when negotiations were to take place, one of the objectives was the final resolution of Jammu and Kashmir. That is an objective. Strangely, the term final resolution figures in Simla in an identical. If you see, the terms are identical. And for us, it seems to me that those words connoted that that the two leaders will meet, not in the two prime ministers, of Pakistani leader and our leader, would meet in the not too distant future and sort this out. And you mentioned there in your book that in two conversations with Pakistanis, he was lamenting, indirectly though, that Pakistan had gone back on its word. Would you care to shed some more light on this? Because it's truly significant for our relationship with Pakistan.
I think, Vivek, you know better than I do. On Simla, you've dealt with this. And there is this very important school of thought which believes that we gave away what we had won in 1971. There were three issues. There was 93,000 prisoners of war, but that is not contentious because General Manekshaw is on record, and I have said so, that these 93,000 prisoners of war give us no leverage whatsoever, and they should be returned. The second issue was the return of territory, on which there was a difference of opinion between P.N. Dhar and P.N. Haksar. P.N. Dhar wanted the territory to be retained. General Manekshaw did not have a point of view on this. It was Mr. Haksar who prevailed upon Mrs. Gandhi. Mrs. Gandhi's cabinet colleagues were of the view that the territory should be retained. And I think Mr. Haksar prevailed on Mrs. Gandhi that this should be part of the settlement that we have. And I think one very important reason which explains Mr. Haksar's actions is the fact that he believed that as long as the eastern border was concerned, the international community was with us. And for him, international community meant the Soviet Union. However, if there was any inkling that India was going to take territory on the western border, of course the Americans and the Chinese would be against us, but even the Soviet Union would not have anything to do with us. And therefore, I think that was a very important factor in the calculus.
Some voices are now claiming that it was not so.
No, I think the evidence is very clear, Vivek. I think the evidence is very, very clear. There's nothing written unless, the Soviet archives open up. But Haksar's archives are very, very clear on this, that the Soviet factor was a very important factor. The Soviets did not want Mr. Bhutto to go back empty-handed. It's as simple as that. And they had, not only did Mrs. Gandhi and Mr. Haksar put their eggs in the Bhutto basket, the Soviets had also put their eggs into the Bhutto basket. And the two important statements that came out after Simla, Rajagopalachari, an inveterate critic of Indira Gandhi, calls it the Pact of Good Hope. And Jayaprakash Narayan, who becomes a critic of Indira Gandhi just 2 years later, says that he hopes that the Simla summit would be followed up by similar summits between the two leaders, which was the expectation in Simla. That now that the CFL has become the LOC, the conversion of the LOC to the IB, the international border, would take some time, would require some more negotiations. And from what I have been able to glean from reading, the fact is that Mr. Bhutto asked for time to prepare his domestic constituency, but he went back and he certainly reneged on his word, as is evident from Mr. Haksar's own lament to Agashahi, and on two different occasions when he talked with Pakistani delegations here. So yes, I mean there was an expectation that I think the role of the Soviet Union is important, but I think it's also the fact is that the alternative was no agreement. It's now Brexit or no deal. It was Simla or no deal. And how would that have played in the international community? And I think it's important to recognize, Vivek, people don't realize this, that the Soviet Union came on India's side only on the 9th of August 1971. Before that, they were hemming, hawing, they were playing footsie with Pakistan, they had in with Pakistan, but what changes the equation is first Kissinger's air dash from Islamabad to Beijing on the 8th of July 1971, and that gives a certain sense of urgency to the Indo-Soviet Treaty, which is entered into on the 9th of August. Let me tell you a very interesting thing that I found in the Haksar archives. Gromyko, the Soviets wanted the Indo-Soviet Treaty to be signed in Moscow between the two heads of state. Indira Gandhi says no, it should be signed in Delhi between the two foreign ministers. So decision is taken that Swaran Singh will sign on behalf of India and Gromyko will sign on behalf of Pakistan. Gromyko, on behalf of the Soviet Union. Gromyko comes to India, plans to come to India and tells the Foreign Office here that he is going to go to Pakistan after signing the Indo-Soviet Treaty. And Haksar said, there is no way, we are not signing this treaty. Gromyko must be told that he comes here, he signs the treaty and goes back to Pakistan, goes back to Moscow. And this is exactly what happens. So, it's only after August that the Soviet Union becomes the ally we all now remember and cherish for its support. So the Soviet Union also was very clear that we support India as long as it comes to, as long as it is East Pakistan and Bangladesh. But moment anything happens on the West Pakistan border, we are not going to support the Indian government.
The last point I'll say, yes, I think, but some place, and Haksar mentions this also, that we'll have to remember the Treaty of Versailles and the consequences. But that's when generosity is part of the, what should I say, the Indian tradition.
Yes, no, Versailles is very much. He uses the word Versailles on more than one occasion. There's no doubt about it. And Shankar Bajpai, whom I've spoken to at length on this, says that, what's the point remembering Versailles? This is. But the fact is, Mr. Haksar is part of the 1930s generation. For them, Versailles brought on World War II. So you can't divorce a man from the context of his times.
To Shakti, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. As chair, let me quickly ask a question and we'll throw it open. One, of course, I just want to explain the Goa thing, since you mentioned it. The civil code in Goa dealing with property is very interesting. When people get married, the property of the wife and the property of the husband come together in the communion of property. And when any of them die, the survivor gets 50%, irrespective of what he or she brought to the wedding. And the 50% is shared between the children, irrespective of the sex. That is the standard principle. It's a 1895, 1890 law. However, of course, patriarchy is patriarchy. So the girls get persuaded into signing documents saying that they're giving up their share in favor of their brother. But that's the reality of it, but just a quick point. Jairam, on this point of civil servant and blind loyalty, you said blind and you went back to blind saying, yes, he recognizes Mrs. Gandhi's weaknesses or faults. But despite that, he stayed on, in that sense, remained loyal to her. And in that sense, therefore, the blind loyalty. And highlighted by just, this whole argument of playing a role as secretary or as principal secretary. I think it's a very thin line. Even as principal secretary in that sense, you're not a member of a formal civil service, but technically you're still governed by the civil service rules in that sense. So, it is a very thin line, and I don't think so any prime minister or principal secretary can get away from it or have not violated it. But when you look into how the evolution of the offices took place, and I'll take you back to the Nehru-Patel discussions on it, and let me assure you, many of you will be on Patel's side on that argument or not on Nehru's side. Because Nehru is telling Patel, if I can't do these things as Prime Minister, I won't be Prime Minister. In other words, Nehru wants to run a very centralized form of government in 1948-49. Lots of correspondence on it. But when you look at, say, and you highlighted it, the reconstitution of the Planning Commission. So Mrs. Gandhi as Prime Minister calls in Pitambar Pant, very eminent person, who's the head of the Perspective Planning Division of the Planning Commission. And Pitambar Pant suggests to her, I think C. Subramanian will make a good deputy chairman. This is a good idea. And by the way, get in B.K. Nehru also. And Gadgil may not like to become. So Mrs. Gandhi as the Prime Minister is discussing with Pitambar Pant who Pitambar Pant's boss should be. So in that sense, there is this breaking of, not silos as much, of breaking of institutional autonomies in that sense. That comes across very, very strongly throughout. And this is just one of the incidents. But on the Haksar thing, and though you say, and rightly so, that Haksar did not lift a finger even when Arun Haksar was raided or Haksar's own house was raided. But I think he notes that in the cabinet meeting, he stared at her throughout and she averted her gaze. She did not look back. So in that sense, he was conveying his anger to her, I think in very, very strong ways. But the question to you was that, at that level of operation, how exactly should a civil servant or somebody holding a civil service position, how exactly should they be behaving in a parliamentary democracy, unlike the US form of government, which is completely different? In a parliamentary kind of democracy, what are the kind of lines that civil service at the highest level be really following?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on the Prime Minister. You've been a Prime Minister's private secretary, and I've been, for a brief while, OSD to a Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister in July of 1991 asked me to do many things with his Congress colleagues. He asked me to go and meet Congress party guys to convince them I was not a member of the Congress party, but I was an OSD to the Prime Minister. And he asked me to go and talk to them about, all this new industrial policy and, why we are doing this, why we're doing. So technically, I was also crossing the Lakshman Rekha. I'm sure as PS to Prime Minister,
I still don't BJP meeting. I've not attended a single BJP meeting.
Not
I sat
attending.
outside. I sat
not
outside.
attending, I'm not saying it, you don't have to attend. But, these are fine lines. Mr. Haksar crossed it enormously. So I think every secretary to Prime Minister, every principal secretary to Prime Minister, I can't believe that Nripendra Mishra has not, talked to BJP, BJP members, not as a government, but as MPs. These things happen. But there is a tradition. I grant you that there is a tradition that civil servants do not get involved in political issues. And Mr. Haksar did get involved. There's no doubt about it. So to that extent, he wrote about, after he left Prime Minister's Secretariat, he wrote an article in Seminar on what is his vision of a committed bureaucracy. I wish he had written that when he was in service. Because what he says in that article is very interesting. He says, for me, a committed bureaucracy or a committed judiciary is one that is committed to the constitutional values, committed to secular values, committed to the scientific temper, and so on and so forth. Now, in the hands of a Haksar, that is not a dangerous cocktail. But in the hands of anybody else, it can become very dangerous. And the only parallel I can draw is with Gandhi. Gandhi brought religion into Indian politics. In fact, one of the reasons why Gandhi and Jinnah fell out was because of this. But in the hands of Gandhi, religion and politics did not become an incendiary issue. But in the hands of with due respect to people of any political persuasion here, in the hands of Yogi Adityanath or in the hands of a Bal Thackeray, religion and politics becomes a very dangerous tool. So it's how you use it. As long as it was Mr. Haksar, the committed bureaucracy, had a larger social purpose as well. However, that larger social purpose was seen through the lens of the Prime Minister. He was committed to constitutional values, but at the same time is also committed to the Prime Minister as an individual. He could pull it off. Remember, this is the same man who was loyal to Indira Gandhi, who tells Indira Gandhi that you better tell your son to go and find another house to live in. That he cannot run the Maruti project staying in your house and start raising money for his project and having less than desirable friends. In fact, the phrase he uses is less than desirable friends, referring to Arjun Das and so on and so forth. So he could do that. But any other principal secretary will not make that distinction. So I think for people who have the ability to speak truth to power, this committed bureaucracy, committed judiciary works. But 9 people out of 10, this becomes sycophancy. And that's what it became subsequently.
We'll open it up. He was, of course, not a sycophant, but definitely committed in that sense where...
He was committed, no doubt about it. He was committed, but he was not a sycophant.
Though Sanjay Gandhi never forgave him for not changing the date to 14th of January. That's beside the point. For Sumani? Let's open up to 3-4 questions. We'll come. 1, 2, 3, 4.